I'm going to go back to where I started. Is this the one I wanted? It is now. Okay, I'm going to talk to you first a little bit about what's going on with what I'm doing. And they've been talking about all these issues about medical treatment. So right now we're involved in a case called the Rizzulli case in Canada. And so it puts it into perspective. This is a case that's been, the Supreme Court of Canada has just agreed to hear it. And it puts it into perspective. You have a man named Hassan Rizzulli. He had a brain tumor, but it was not malignant. It was not growing in any way. It wasn't a problem. But he was losing his hearing a bit and stuff. So they agreed to do surgery. They did surgery on him. And he had post-surgery infection, which put him into a coma. His wife was a physician in Iran, so she understands medicine very well. And after he had been in coma for a while, they decided to test him. They said he was in persistent vegetative state, and they told the family they're going to remove his ventilator. And the family said, no, we're Sunni Muslims. We don't believe it's morally right to remove his ventilator. And the family went to the court to ask for an injunction, because the doctors said, we don't need your permission to withdraw the ventilator. We believe it's futile. We can just withdraw it. So that went to the courts. It went to the lower court said, we don't need to give you an injunction because according to the law of Ontario, where I live, they said the doctors are required to obtain consent before withdrawing a life-sustaining treatment. So that'd be very different than Texas. And then it went to the Ontario Court of Appeal because the doctors appealed it. They said, no, we have the right to withdraw. So I went to the Ontario Court of Appeal, who unanimously agreed. There was 3 judges on the panel. They unanimously agreed with us. It was actually very interesting. We intervened in the case. We got intervening standing. And it was very interesting reading the result of the trial because what we wrote and what the Court of Appeal final decision was were pretty close to being identical. So it was very nice to see that. And now it's going to the Supreme Court of Canada. So I was actually very interested in some of these cases because, of course, these American decisions and things like that will be part of the decision of the Supreme Court of Canada. We're involved in something called the Carter case. And I mentioned to you, I didn't talk about Switzerland earlier, but it's very interesting. How many, of course, realize in Switzerland they have these suicide clinics? Some of you do. That's good. I don't want you all to know about it. The reason is that there's the one called the Dignitas Clinic, and they specialize in foreign suicides. So, you sign up, you become a member, and you pay your membership fee, and then you go to them and they kill you. So anyway, Kay Carter was a member of the Right to Die Society in Canada, and she was not terminally ill, but she was in her early 90s, and she had these degenerative conditions, so her bones were degenerating and everything in her cartilage, and she was in a fair amount of pain, she said, and so they went to Switzerland, and she died by assisted suicide at the Dignitas Clinic in Switzerland. So then they brought the case to the court saying that Kay Carter was denied her right to assisted suicide in Canada. That was really challenging. And the family said that because they brought her there, they technically had broken Canadian law, even though they hadn't been charged. They had technically broke the law, and therefore they needed the law to be overturned to protect them. What happened is this Carter case is very wide, actually, because they're not just looking at the Assisted Suicide Act. They're looking to legalize assisted suicide and euthanasia, and not for terminally ill reasons. And they've included in their mental pain and everything else. So what it is the BC Civil Liberties Association is helping them, and they're trying to go for the whole enchilada, death on demand. And I mentioned all these other things. That's just parts of the criminal code they're asking to strike down. I find this case very funny. I say to people, it takes a few years to become a lawyer. I guess it's because there's a lot to the criminal code. You have to learn to become a good lawyer. So, this case will just strike out a whole piles of parts of the criminal code and make it easier. They've taken a very radical position in this case. So that's the other thing. We intervened in that case. So that's the second case we intervened in. Then what happened is that they were granted standing, the family, to have the case heard. But the judge said, well, there's nothing pressing because Gloria Taylor was dead already and the family weren't prosecuted. So they said, we'll hear the case, but there's nothing pressing. And so then they found this lady named, Kay Carter. So then they found this lady named Gloria Taylor who was ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. And then the judge agreed that, oh, well, that's important. They fast-tracked it, and they heard it beginning in November. They heard it in November and December, and we're expecting a decision in the next week or so. Then there's the LeBlanc case in Quebec. So this is another one. We've applied for intervening standing in this one too. And this is a woman with ALS, and she's asking for assisted suicide through Quebec to strike it down. But remember, it's federal law they're asking to strike down. So if you're wondering what some of us do for a living, we're busy. Okay, this is where I ended last time. I didn't get into it. You should know all about the Final Exit Network if you're in Minnesota, because you're going to be hearing a case about it soon. So members of the Final Exit Network, they're a group that counsels and aids people to commit suicide. And they were indicted in the death of Doreen Dunn. She died on May 30th, 2007. Okay? And those were the people who were indicted. It was Lawrence Egbert, who's now 84, Jerry Dinkin, who's 81, Robert Matthews, 66, and Thomas Goodwin, who's 65. Now, Thomas Goodwin was also, at a point, the president of the World Federation of Right to Die Societies. So he's a big guy in the death movement. Not to say that the others aren't, or think they're big. So what was it all about? Well, they've been charged with 17 counts. They've been indicted with 17 counts for this case. So this is pretty important. And it was said in the paper, this investigation and prosecution is not politically motivated as an attack on the Right to Die movement. That's what the prosecutor said. Rather, it is an effort to bring to justice a corporation and several of its officers and volunteers who are they've allegedly advised, encouraged, or assisted Doreen Dunn in taking of her own life. Now, I can tell you a little bit about the Final Exit Network. They have a manual. And a few years ago, when they were being investigated in the Georgia case, the police got hold of their manual, and the parts of the manual were published in this one document. And it explained in that document that in their own manual, their own instructions, what they use is they kill you by asphyxiation, right? They use the suicide bags and helium. Too much information. And what they do is they make sure that there's always 2 volunteers there so they can hold your hands. And the reason is that nobody in the end wants to die this way. Even though it's a very short period of time and it goes very quick to die that way, it's very fast. Nonetheless, they know as an example, people near the end get really antsy and want to pull it off. So they always say you need 2 volunteers, one who holds the one hand and one who holds the other hand, because they know this person's going to try and take the bag off. So let's look at some of the studies, and this is quite important. Now, some people say to me, oh, but Americans, we don't really care about what's going on in Europe. Like Canadians, we're sort of a hybrid. We're a bit European, a bit American, right? So we do care about what's going on in Europe, but I think it's important to know what's going on in Europe, because I think it's part of human nature that these things will be abused. In the same way as you see all this medical abuse and things that occur, there are some people who would never do that. Some physicians are very careful, who will not do things that are wrong or how would you say, might be perceived as causing somebody else's death or things. Some physicians would never do that. And others have been trained through other attitudes that maybe it's the best thing. So you see in the more recent stats, now you need to know that in the Netherlands they do a major macro study every 5 years. So every year they release the numbers of euthanasia assisted suicide deaths, and then every 5 years they do that major study where they give doctors anonymity, and then they send out questionnaires to all the doctors across the Netherlands. And there was a study in 1990, the Remmerling report, and then 95 and 2000, 2005. There was a study in 2010. It's not been published. It's not been published yet. We haven't seen it. The study from 2005 came out in 2007. That's the year it came out, and it showed 550 deaths without request or consent per year. Now, you note I put there that the 2000 study said 950. You might notice that the one that people often refer to, the one from 1990, it showed 1,040. So when this study came out in 2007, showing the 2005 numbers, there was a lot of comments, oh, things are getting better in the Netherlands. And I remember writing an article about this saying, unless you're one of the 550, things appear to be getting a little bit better in the Netherlands because, of course. But what's also changed in the Netherlands is that they brought in a form of palliative care, which is interesting. It didn't really exist in the Netherlands before. And it's interesting how they've done it. They've set up these palliative care wings in hospitals. But what they're doing now is this massive amount of death by dehydration. Right? A little over 10% of all deaths in the Netherlands are death by dehydration. So you're seeing this interesting situation where, in fact, euthanasia is not going down. It's actually going way up. It did shift a bit, but now even the numbers from there are going way up. Deaths without request or consent. Most people would call that murder. Others might be calling it medical abuse. Some would say, why has no one been prosecuted? Belgium. Well, I already told you a little bit about Belgium. Belgium allows euthanasia only. There's two regions of Belgium, two main regions. You have the French and you have the Dutch regions, right, in Belgium. It's a split country that way. This study was published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. It was just a study that they published. And it was on euthanasia deaths. Now, this was a very good study. I really like this because what the authors of the study did is they first looked at the coroner's reports and they determined that that was a euthanasia death from the coroner's reports. And then they sent the questionnaire to the doctor who did the act. So that's pretty good, right? You can't beat that, right? And they got 208 responses, and of the 208 responses, the doctors admitted that 66 of those deaths were without request or consent. I think that's substantial. It's 32%. That's huge. The other thing is of course, the study can't be argued. Now, there was, in the Canadian Medical Association Journal, there was a doctor who challenged the study saying, oh, surely, you know, these deaths might have been family members who are saying, well, you know, this person might not have ever written it down. This person's unconscious or whatever. They've never written this down, but this was part of this person's values, etc. And the author of the study did respond to that, saying, well, you're right. Often it could have been a family member. That's true. But the point of the response was there was no request or consent. That was the point. And whether families demanded it or not, the law says there must be request or consent. No one was prosecuted. Then there was a study by the same group done on nurses. So they sent questionnaires to nurses across Belgium. And they received 1,678 responses. So that's pretty good. Pretty good. And in that, there was the questionnaire. From the information from the questionnaire, they determined that those nurses had been involved with 248 euthanasia deaths, and 120 were done without request or consent. 45%. Now, this study might not be as good a study to follow, simply because it's possible that you have a bit of double reporting in there and things like that. It's possible there was two nurses involved. The importance of this is it shows you, first of all, nurses are involved in euthanasia. Nurses can't approve it in Belgium, according to the law at least, but they are allowed to do it. The study is very interesting when you look at it further, because when you analyze the information, it's quite clear that nurses are asked to do euthanasia when the case might be a little bit iffy, and the doctor decides, well, I'll just let the nurse do it. And this was another study that came out, very interesting again, and it came out from the British Medical Association Journal, and it showed that 52.8% of all euthanasia deaths are reported. That means that 47.2% of euthanasia deaths are not reported in Belgium. What was very interesting is a lot of people say, well, wait a second. One of the reasons was that doctors were confused whether it was euthanasia or not. And so the point of it is they're doing the study and they're saying, well, first of all, Belgium does not define euthanasia as a specific act. It's an act to cause death, right? They do not put in, it doesn't say in the law, you must use this barbiturate and do it in this way. It doesn't say that, right? So the point of the study was, well, if you're intentionally causing death, then death is the result. That is euthanasia, and how often you're reporting. But even 93%, only 93% of the time, you say that's pretty good. 93% of the time when it was done in a traditional manner, meaning that they give you this muscle relaxant and then this barbiturate, 93% of that time they're reporting. I mean, 7% of the time when they're doing it in the obvious way that everybody would know about, they still didn't report. What's further important about this, when you read the study, they explain why they weren't reporting. 7% of the doctors said that they just don't report at all. They just don't. It's not necessary. They don't think it's our right to know or anybody's right to know. They just don't report. And then a bunch of doctors said, well, some of these cases, it'd be hard to discuss it with family and everything, and these were deaths without request or consent, and they don't report. Why don't they report? Because maybe they might get in trouble. Maybe it was questionable. So they just don't report. the point of it is that if you're not reporting it, then all the stats that we get from Belgium mean nothing. They mean nothing. Okay. I was going to, anyway, I'll talk about this too. The issue of depression. Okay, I'm going to say something about the deaths without request or consent. It's a strong argument for us, but the other side has come up with a response. I don't know if anybody likes to read the other side quite well. These deaths are referred to as Lauer deaths, right? These are deaths without request or consent. The Dutch term they use for that is called Lauer. And their argument is that before legalization, in fact, there were more deaths without request or consent than there is now. That's what they argue. So they say before 2002, when they legalized euthanasia in either the Belgium or the Netherlands, that those numbers were much higher. And in fact, legalization has meant there's been fewer of those. Therefore, things are improving. That's how they argue it. They also argue that we are having lots of deaths without request or consent going on in our culture, and that we should not be judging them for their deaths without request or consent. And they literally do say that. They say that studies have shown that there's a certain percentage of deaths without request or consent going on in the United States. It's going on in Canada. There's a good response to that. There was a study done in the UK about 2005 on the very question of euthanasia that's being done. And they found that actually there was actually a very low number of euthanasia deaths going on in the UK. And they did this study by asking physicians through a questionnaire point of view, granting them full anonymity, and there was very little actually being suggested that was actually going on. Whether or not that was accurate or not, the point is that they're arguing that where it's legal, yes, it's still going on, but it's a lot less there than it is here, is what they're arguing with us. It's a very difficult point of view to argue. You'd have to have really good studies that compare apples to apples to do that. Nonetheless, the point is for them to say that when it's legal, it's safe, that's foolish. Okay, that's foolish. Well, they're assuming you want to die anyway, right? That's what they're assuming. But they're saying, oh, you don't get abuse. Anyway, let's go further. This study is the best study on depression there is. There's lots of studies on depression that are out there. The reason this study is so good is it's done by this Dr. Vanderlee in the Netherlands, who's a pro-euthanasia doctor. So I've been using this study in my presentations for a few years. And she did her study specifically to prove that people who are depressed are not asking for euthanasia because of depression, but because of strongly held opinions. Okay, so I'm strongly for euthanasia. I'm now terminally ill. I want to die by my free right of euthanasia. That's what she thought it was. So therefore, she did this study, and what did she find? So you see her, this is her hypothesis that she puts right into her study. She's quite honest, that their clinical impression was that requests for euthanasia were based on well-considered decisions and not depression in the Netherlands. She also admits in her study that the reason she did the study was all the previous studies on depression and euthanasia were done in countries where it was illegal. And she said those are false studies because it's illegal in those countries where it was legal in the Netherlands, therefore that the results would be different. But what does she find? To our surprise, we found that a depressed mood was associated with more requests for euthanasia. Patients with a depressed mood were associated with a 4x, it was actually a 4.1 times, 4 times greater risk of requesting euthanasia. Now let's get this into perspective. 4 times greater risk. That's 400% greater risk of requesting euthanasia. Okay? So what does this mean? This doesn't mean that only people who are going through depression or feelings of hopelessness are requesting euthanasia. It just means that if you are going through depression or feelings of hopelessness, you're very likely to request euthanasia. And in fact, when they looked at the numbers further, the numbers are very highly skewed towards people who are experiencing depression or feelings of hopelessness. Then she concluded that depression is a primary risk factor for requests for euthanasia. Now, the other side had argued all the time that this was not true. That simply, this is about, worldview, and people in depression might have a factor too, because it's normal people who are, terminally ill or going through chronic conditions are going to be depressed. That's normal. Nonetheless, it's important to know that, in fact, it is a primary risk factor without a question. Well, then let's look at Oregon. Now, why do we want to talk about Oregon with this? Well, one of the safeguards they have in the state of Oregon and in Washington State is that if someone is showing signs of hopelessness or depression, they're supposed to be, in the law, it suggests that they be sent for psychiatric or psychological assessment. Because, of course, in the states where it's legal, we're not going to assist the suicide of depressed people, right? Only competent people. So Linda Ganzini, who's not a friend of ours, Linda Ganzini, we always wondered where she stood. She was never quite clear about where she stood on the issue, but she was one of the lead witnesses in the Carter case in British Columbia, and in being a counter, when the lawyers were asking her questions on the whole thing, she admitted there were certain problems with the Oregon law and things like that, and etc. Her response was that, well, it's not that we should stop doing assisted suicide, it's that maybe it needs to be tweaked a bit. So obviously she's pro. Anyway, she did a study of people who had requested assisted suicide, and she looked at 58 people who had requested assisted suicide, and these are people who had gone to either Compassion Choices or asked their doctor, but they had joined the study. In fact, when you look at the study, she admits that almost everybody from her study were people who had contacted Compassion Choices. And of the 58, she's diagnosed 15 of them, 26%, as being either depressed or experiencing feelings of hopelessness. So that's a significant number. So that doesn't surprise us, because people going through chronic conditions, long-term pain, or terminal illness, it's likely that they might feel depression. It's likely that they might have feelings of hopelessness. So that's not the surprising thing. The point of it is that of these 15, none of them were offered a psychiatric or psychological assessment by their doctors. Not one of them were. 3 of them did die by assisted suicide in the end. And the only reason she's then identified them as being depressed or under that category was because they joined the study. So the question is, are people who are depressed or somewhat incompetent dying by assisted suicide in the state of Oregon? The answer is yes, without a question. In 2007, which is the year that that study was being completed, there was 49 people who were reported to have died by assisted suicide in the state of Oregon. Now I say reported to because it's possible the numbers are out a tiny, tiny bit, right? Because there's no mechanism for assuring that all reports come in Oregon. There's no mechanism at all. None of them were offered a psychiatric or a psychological assessment, not one of them. And when you go to the website for the Oregon Health Division on their Death with Dignity Act, you can just click the button and download the questionnaire if you're a psychiatrist or a psychologist and put them to the assessment, but not one of them were offered that. So that's very important. You should know that in the very first year that assisted suicide was legalized, there was 23 reported deaths by assisted suicide, and 11 of them were sent for a psychiatric or psychological assessment. After that, it went down, 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 and now it's nearly no one. Well, why? Well, because there's a few reasons, and I'm going to get into those. One of the reasons is people just get used to doing it. But there's a second reason. We'll get into that in a minute. So in the state of Oregon, there's been 596 reported cases of assisted suicide in Oregon in the 14 years. 596. In 2011, there were 71 reported cases. One of them was referred for a psychiatric or psychological assessment. One of them. That's it. And in 2009, none of the 59 were. 2009 is an important year for another reason. This is also important because I don't put it here, but in 2011, the report came out, and for the first time, they're actually admitting that some of those reports, some of these deaths are not being reported. They know of 2 in particular that were not reported in 2011, and they mentioned that. But previous years, they just never mentioned it. So I guess they're finally deciding to look at the number of prescriptions, the number of dead people, the number of reports, and start trying to do some math and figure out what happened to it all. And they found that there were some reports that didn't come in 2011. I'm going to say something else too, which is important. Basing information on these reports is sort of difficult. What do the reports tell us? Well, first of all, who does the report? Who does the report? No, it's the doctor who prescribes the assisted suicide who writes the report. Okay? So doctor writes prescription for assisted suicide. Is doctor going to self-report if the person probably didn't qualify? No, doctors don't self-report. It's the same in the Netherlands. in the Netherlands and Belgium. Why are these doctors not sending in reports in Belgium? Well, first of all, no one's following up anyway. So, and if you've got a case which is a bit iffy, either you can report and lie on the report, because guess what? You're the one sending in the report anyway. Or you just don't bother sending it in at all. Why bother sending in a report if you're concerned about how they're going to treat you? Because maybe you did something wrong. Right? Here, the doctors do, so it's self-reporting. What do they report? Well, basically, we know the age of the people who died, we know their condition, things like that. We really, in the end, the reasons they're putting down, they're like the checkbox reasons, they really don't get down to the social context of why the person chose assisted suicide. But this is the other big reason that we have to be concerned about it. In 2009, Compassion Choices put in their annual report, and I haven't seen this in their annual report since. Maybe it's because a bunch of us picked up on it, that of the 59 assisted suicide deaths that year, 57 were done by them. 57 of 59, they did. So what does that mean? That means so-and-so may have contacted her doctor, and the doctor wasn't quite sure, but the doctor might have said, well, I'm not sure how all this works, I haven't done this before, but might have just given them the contact for Compassion Choices. The person contacts Compassion Choices, and all the rest is figured out from there, right? Compassion Choices makes sure that you go to your doctor, you get the right forms done, or it's their doctor. In fact, there's another report that shows that in a huge number of cases, the second doctor signing off is always the same doctor. So you get this Compassion Choices doctor who's become a professional signer. Reporting's done after the death. How is that a safeguard when they report after the death? It's the same thing in the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg. These are after the death reporting cases. You're dead, we send in a report. Does the physician self-report? No. There's no mechanism in Oregon to ensure that all assisted suicide deaths are reported. The biggest thing also is a few other big things. There's no witness at the time of death. No witness. Well, that's sort of important because we don't know how people actually died. The other question is, the reports do claim how often the doctor was there at the time of death. Of the 71 deaths last year that were reported, how many times was the doctor there? I think it was 6. 6 times the doctor was there. So who was there the other times? Compassion Choices people are at the death. Okay. I should tell you about one other thing which is interesting. They're suicide parties. Have you heard about what they do? They're goodbye parties that they have. So let's say you get your prescription, and there's a 15-day waiting period. So you've got your prescription now, and you're feeling pretty good. So you've decided, well, we're going to see, how long life can take us. That's sort of nice. And 2 months has passed, and 3 months has passed, and 4 months has passed. And people are getting a little bit funny about this. Well, you've got your prescription. What are you waiting for? So what happens is they set up the goodbye party. And they've got a whole video on this. And there was a whole big news thing done about this, but they set up the goodbye party, and they invite your friends over, and you have your favorite drinks and your favorite music and everything, and everybody hugs you and says goodbye, and at the end of the night, you're supposed to take your lethal dose, right? That sounds like coercion to me. Yeah?
Are they subject to autopsies, or are they waived because assisted suicide is permitted?
Well, I don't know why they would do an autopsy if you took a lethal dose, because we know what the cause of death is. The only thing that's interesting about all this is in Washington State, the autopsy, if they do an autopsy, the cause of death is always supposed to be written down, or at least in the coroner's report, the cause of death is always supposed to be written down as the condition the person had, and they're not supposed to put down Death with Dignity Act. Well, let's look at this. I mentioned about homicide, suicide in Idaho. Remember I mentioned that story about Idaho, what happened? Well, this is the study here. I referred to Donna Cohen. She's an expert on suicide, and she's well published. She's one of the leading experts. She did this study out of Florida. And she said, well, many of these cases were reported as a loving couple where one kills the other spouse for reasons of compassion. So it's like this. Man loves his wife so much that he kills her and then kills himself. The study found that in nearly all the cases, the spouse who does the act usually had a history of abuse, and resistance marks were usually found on the victim. I think it's quite clear that when this occurs, these are men who have a controlling nature to them, and their wives. And the other thing you need to know, women, is that in all of those 20 cases in the study, Donna Cohen's quite clear. She wasn't looking for it to be men killing their wives. She just took 20 good cases and studied them. Right? In all 20 cases, it was the man who killed his wife and then killed himself. And it doesn't mean that it never happens the other way. It's just almost impossible to find cases the other way. So watch out, ladies. The point of it is these are controlling men. Now their wife is sick, and for whatever reason they can't handle it, and they kill their wives and kill themselves. Well, you need to know about this. How many people know about the Groningen or the Groningen protocol in the Netherlands? There's a few hands. There's only a few hands? Okay, so this is the history of this, and I think you should know about it because it's if you legalize this stuff, it's coming to a neighborhood near you. So what happened is in the Netherlands, you first had judge-made law, right? Previous to 2002 in the Netherlands, all the legalization of euthanasia was done through the courts. So they had a couple cases that occurred. And if you don't believe me about the Groningen Protocol, you can go to the New England Journal of Medicine, March 10, 2005, and look it up. Everything I'm saying is completely accurate. So they had two cases in the mid-90s. One was of a child with trisomy 13, and another was of a child with spina bifida that were euthanized, and both went to the courts. Okay? Obviously, newborn babies cannot give request or consent. So what they did is, in both cases, those doctors were let off. You know, they're given a little, child was suffering, it was okay. And so the research that created the Groningen Protocol, and you have to read the Groningen Protocol to really get the gist of this, they based it on 22 children who had been born with spina bifida and who had been euthanized. And that's what they based the Groningen Protocol on. So this is about killing newborns with disabilities. That's what it's about. The other thing you need to know about it is the reason it exists is those court cases happened in the mid-90s, so you know that the doctors in the Netherlands were already routinely killing babies with disabilities by 2002. There had been a political trade-off in 2002 because the Christian Democrats, many of them opposed euthanasia. So in order to legalize it in 2002, the political trade-off was you couldn't euthanize somebody under 12. That's the political trade-off, right? But they'd already been doing it. So you couldn't do it under 12 according to the new law, but they'd already been doing it. So, of course, in the typical Dutch way, if you follow the protocol, then you can do it, right? I'm sort of Dutch, okay? So this is what the protocol says. The criteria is that the infant must have a certain diagnosis and prognosis. Remember, these are newborns we're talking about. Newborns with spina bifida. Does anybody here know people with spina bifida? Quite a few of you. Yeah, it was more common in the past before we eliminated them before birth. Yeah. Anyway, the fact of it is at birth, is it possible to determine the prognosis of that newborn child? Not at all, no. The infant must have hopeless and unbearable suffering. Well, they always throw that in. You know why that language is in there? To make you feel better. That child was going to have hopeless and unbearable suffering. People with spina bifida do not live with hopeless and unbearable suffering. They don't. Criteria 1 and 2 must be confirmed by at least one independent doctor. It doesn't matter. They could have put 3 independent doctors. It doesn't matter. The doctors who do the killing know the doctors who will approve. Right? Both parents must give informed consent. Well, let's think this one through. What does it mean to give informed consent? So you have a couple who are expecting a beautiful newborn baby, because that's what's happened here. Usually they didn't have any pre-testing and stuff. They didn't realize they were going to have a child with a disability. So they think they're going to have this beautiful, perfect child, and what happens is they get a beautiful child with a disability instead, and they're in shock, and now they have to give informed consent. Are we going to treat them? Are we going to not treat them? Are we going to kill them? Are we going to not kill them? I don't consider that informed consent. I don't think that's informed consent at all. Dr. De Wever, who's still the president of our group in Canada, he was a pediatric oncologist for all of his life. He was the head of the children's cancer at the major children's hospital for 30 years. And as he said, when he knew the parents were distraught, now I'm saying this just to understand, so you can clearly understand where this is coming from. When I knew the parents were clearly distraught, I wouldn't ask them, I would make suggestions to them. Maybe we should do this. Maybe we should do that. Because obviously sometimes these parents were right, they were just mentally right out of it. Their child is going through this and they're upset, right? He said at that point I wouldn't ask, I would suggest, maybe we should do this. And of course then they'd usually say yes and everything was fine. The procedure must be carried out in accordance with accepted medical standard. When was it accepted medical standard to kill newborn babies? And then they must report it. Remember, babies dead when they send in the report, nobody was protected. What the reporting is about is to protect the doctors. Let's be brutally honest. And it's to make everybody feel good. We sent in our reports. We looked at it. No one's ever prosecuted anyway. Group 1. Well, Group 1 are infants with no chance of survival. Okay? So how they do it in the Netherlands is they put them on life support when they're born, and then they have a discussion on what to do. Now, people in the death lobby would probably think that this is a very reasonable thing to do. Child's born, no chance of survival. I believe there's a difference between killing and letting die. If a child has no chance of survival, we should care for them and let them die naturally. But this means we kill them. Well, let's look at Group 2. Group 2 are infants who may survive after a period of intensive treatment, but expectations are grim. So these are children who will need a fair amount of medical treatment, right? But they might survive. And actually, their chances of survival with today's technology might be reasonably good. But they'd be expensive to have to care for, wouldn't they? Because they're going to need a fair amount of medical treatment. They have severe cognitive disabilities or organ damage or things like that. Once again, if they're going to die, if they were to die, I think there's a big difference in killing and letting die. I think we shouldn't be killing people, should we? Let's look at Group 3. Now remember, this is part of the Groningen Protocol. I don't see the euthanasia lobby saying, I think Group 3 is going too far. But infants with a poor prognosis, but who do not depend on technology for their physiological stability. So these are babies that if you don't provide treatment for them, they're going to survive. You know the problem with them? They're disabled. They're better off dead, right? This group can survive without medical treatment, but is perceived as better off dead. And then they said, whose suffering is severe, sustained, and cannot be alleviated. What do they mean by suffering is severe, sustained, and cannot be alleviated? Once again, it's to make you feel better. We had to do this. We were caring parents. We had to do this. The child was going to suffer. We did the right thing. This is eugenics at its clearest understanding. It's sad that in the Netherlands they have euthanasia, they have the Groningen Protocol. This is what it's all about. And I think this makes it very clear really what it comes down to, all these issues. These are newborns, but it's in the same thing if you had a dementia. The person with dementia, I mean a really advanced stage dementia, it's more that it bothers us seeing them like that than it bothers them. And the big discussion right now is eliminating their lives. Same idea. And remember, the concept of suffering in the document is not limited to current suffering, but also possible future suffering. And I always ask the question, how many in this room will experience possible future suffering? Yeah, that's what it's about. Keys to winning the battle. We must focus on the likely victims, focus on elder abuse. Why elder abuse? I didn't talk about that very much. I think my time's almost up, isn't it? 10 minutes? I have 10 minutes. Oh, I must have cut down or something. What is, why elder abuse? Well, I already explained that before. It's because we simply cannot, in this culture, for some reason, control it. We cannot protect elders because they're unwilling to report it. Why are they unwilling to report it? Well, maybe that's going to change in the next generation, that they will report it. Why? Because they feel they're being, because first of all, stats show that 70% of elder abuse is done by family or friends or somebody that person's dependent on. So what it is it's you experiencing abuse from either your son or your daughter or a close friend or somebody who you're dependent upon. And they don't want to report that because it might get worse. That's right, it might get worse. And so when so-and-so is asking for assisted suicide, or in so-and-so it seems to be indicating that they wouldn't want any further medical treatment because they don't want to be a burden on their children, is it a sign of abuse? Often it is. Is it always a sign of abuse? No, there's some of those cases, obviously, of the radical autonomist who believes they're, exercising the right of personal, freedom. Nonetheless, it's often abuse, without a question. Working with people from all points of view. Today, I think we have a fairly homogeneous crowd here. We are obviously from a very strong faith base for the most part, and that's all good. We're not going to win unless we're willing to work with the world. It's like it is. So the fact of it is that one thing that's made me successful in Canada has been the fact that I work very closely with the disability community. And for instance, the Council of Canadians with Disabilities and us worked very, very much as a team on several issues. There are also other people who are on my board who sadly are not pro-life, but who are very opposed to these issues. Why are they on my board? Because A, they are totally in agreement with the way we're going, but secondly, because I'm working with everybody and they're interested. I'm working with everybody and they're interested. I must be very clear about something. We've been reasonably successful in Canada. When I talk about these cases in the courts, in April of 2010, there was a bill in Parliament in Canada to legalize euthanasia and assisted suicide. We defeated it, 228 to 59. 228 to 59. That's phenomenal. That wasn't, we currently have a conservative a majority government. That's before the majority government was in place. That's why we had a conservative minority government. You have to understand, in Canada, we've got 4 major parties in the federal parliament. So it's hard to get a majority. So it was a minority government. But even then, how did we do it? We did it basically by me flying to Ottawa and spending time meeting with members of parliament. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't spend my time working on my friends, those in parliament who I knew supported my position. It doesn't mean I never met with them. Obviously, I'm going to meet with them because it's sort of nice to have meetings with them. I spent my time meeting with people who I thought were in the middle. And so I was able to bring people over one at a time, and by finding out, well, who's your friend in Parliament? So I had certain liberals I was working with, certain socialists. The Bloc, they're the ones who want Quebec separation. I didn't work with them at all. One reason is I don't speak French. Anyway, you need to do that. That's how it works. You need to focus on the way to win. But what happened is that soon after, in Victoria, BC, which is just a city where there was the Right to Die movement, there was a big presentation being put on, and I sent one of our supporters to hear it, and one of their big leaders announced right there and then, we're obviously not going to win in Parliament, so we've been working now on how we're going to go in the courts. Because obviously, if you can't win in Parliament, maybe the judges will give it to you. And that's exactly what we're going to be facing. If you look at Compassion Choices, what they've done, they tried in the courts in Montana and were somewhat successful. They tried in the courts in Connecticut, and they're going to be trying in many places. They've got a case going on right now. Is it in somewhere in the southern U.S., New Mexico or something? There's a case that they've launched. There's another. So what they're doing is they're saying, if we can win here, we're going to either do it by plebiscite, we're going to try to do it in your legislature, and if we think we can't win there, we're going to try and do it in the courts. Same thing you're going to be facing. One of the problems we have in the U.S. is there isn't... so in Canada, I've been at this since 1999. So that's a fair amount of time. And so we have a fairly large support base. It didn't happen overnight. It took years and years. It's like anything. It's like any group, like Human Life Alliance or anything like that. It takes years to build it, right? But we lack that type of infrastructure here in the U.S. for this issue. And I'll be honest with you, it's very difficult. You see, where's my background? This is on tape, so the other side is going to say, we now know, well, they can Google me and find out. My background is obviously I used to work for the church and I ran a pro-life office. Who are my main allies? Obviously the pro-life groups are my main allies. They're not my only allies, but they're obviously my main allies, right? But if we were to be challenging this whole issue as, let's say, so-and-so, the pro-life group in Canada running this campaign, Because of the demographics, we wouldn't win. Because most Canadian politicians are pro-abortion. Wouldn't have a chance. Some states are like that too. Some states, the majority would be pro-abortion. Right? So what do we exist to do? We work together with all others, and our goal is to win. The courts are more difficult. We need that in the U.S. So, when I went to Australia several years ago, and now I'm going back to do another tour there, the goal was to find a few people willing to set up a group, and we did it. There's a group set up. They're active. It's going. Paul Russell does this full-time in Australia, running this group called HOPE. We need the same thing in the U.S. We have groups in the U.S., but not quite like what I do. Not like what I do. And you need that. You need that organizing arm that's willing to set up campaigns and be organized in that focus, not just doing education alone. That's important. Don't get me wrong. That information is very important. But I mean also getting down and dirty into the political scene and making it happen and organizing it the right way. Because it takes a technique. And let's also be brutally honest. It doesn't matter whether you're in Minnesota or in Texas. There's a difference in the people, yes. But certain arguments, they will vary on how they're accepted. That's correct. But certain arguments tend to work better than others. And if you're going to make the mistake about focusing on an argument that's already proven not to work very well, you're not going to do very well. Anyway, that's my message to you. If there's people wanting to do that kind of a thing, I'm happy to work with you. And I think I saw a 5 minute sign. You can ask a question if you want, because I got about a minute now. Right? Yes?
Why did you leave out pro-life as far as, I know this is euthanasia, what you're doing after you're born, but to me, if you started as pro-life and you didn't actually tell anybody how many spina bifida or mongoloid children or disabled children are killed before they're born, that's part of it. To me, that's very important information.
Obviously, I'm not going to argue with you about that. But what I'm going to say to you is that you have to be focused. You need experts who do specific things. And the reason you need that is because we're trying to build coalition with others. The only way to be effectively winning is to have others who might not agree with us on everything, but are willing to work with us on this issue. That's our only chance. And if you look at how the polling looks, some states, we don't look good for this issue. It just doesn't look good. So without working with a wider coalition, it's going to be very difficult to win anything. And if you want to stop the juggernaut, you have to be finding your allies where you can find them. So by focusing on this issue and euthanasia and assisted suicide, that allows me to work with other people. So if I were to focus on all kinds of other issues...
I don't mean that. I just mean...
I know what you're saying, but you know...
little facts about how many are killed before they're born.
And that's fine. And I don't have a problem with that, but I do think that... I might have a hard time holding a coalition together if I'm not completely focused. I agree with you, and actually the funny thing is the disability community is the prime example. They're starting to come over and talk more about the whole eugenic attitude and the identification being happening in utero and how they're eliminating people with disabilities. They're starting to talk about that. But it's a very difficult issue for them to talk about. Because they, as an organization, not all of them, because they're not homogeneous, but I mean, as organizations, the leading disability rights groups tend to be in favor of abortion rights too. So these are very difficult things for them to deal with. So it's best that we just stay with, in a politically focused way. It just means that it's the most expedient way at this time to hold back the juggernaut. That's what I'm saying. And I'm going to continue that way. Yeah?
You say you have certain arguments that tend to work better than others. Do you have like a pamphlet or that written out, what the
Yeah, there is. You can go to the website, but also I can email it to you. I have an email list that you can join, and you will get emails from me. If you want to delete them, you can go ahead. I prefer that you donate to me because obviously I don't exist without donations. But the fact of it is that I can then email you. If you email that request, I'll just email you the information. It's not a problem. Yes, and if you go to my blog, I've got a blog with almost 1,000 articles on it, and you can just go down and check it out, and you'll see that I've got all the arguments. The problem with blogs is that you have it all organized by title and everything, but you really only see the most recent blogs up. So you have to go search through it to find what you're looking for, because I'm not going to keep posting the same article once a month. in order to make sure it's up near the top. Yes?
In the United States, there's about 3 million people that die yearly from smallpox. And about 1.5 million of them are passing through palliative and hospice care now. Does anybody have a grasp on how many of those are actually?
You know, that's a study that needs to be done, and that's a very good idea. These type of stats need to be looked at. It'll never be done. You're right. You know what's interesting, though? We can be, and actually, I know it's 2 o'clock, and you have your break, and I do have, I'm going to be leaving soon, so if you do want to join my email list, you can do it. We can be tough on the Dutch all we want, but every 5 years they do a meta-study where they send out a questionnaire to all the physicians, and they give them total anonymity, so the physicians know that no matter what they write on that form, they're not going to get arrested for it. And their numbers might not be perfect, but at least we have these numbers, and we say, well, look what they're saying. And then they say, well, in defense of us, you guys are doing it too. You just don't have the studies proving it. Okay, Ron, why don't you send me that study, because that's actually good. And then I'll blog it. And those are actually in the room who decide to follow my blog, you'll see it. Okay, so it's your break time, and I'm going to say thank you very much. You can actually find all of it. You have my newsletter in your information, and I have some cards on my table. You can grab them, and it's alexshadenberg.blogspot.com, and spell it correctly, alexshadenberg.blogspot.com. You can Google me. You're going to notice that if you put in Alex Shadenberg and Google me, gosh, I'm everywhere.